Good morning, everyone. May we request you to make your way to your seats. We are a little behind time, 5 minutes to be exact. I'd like to catch up so that we are on time as we move on. Welcome and good morning once again. So the striking reality is this. Women make up over 52% of Sri Lanka's population and enjoy high levels of education, but nearly 1/3 remain outside the labor force. These are statistics we all know, but these are statistics that simply don't go away or make better. This means that millions of skilled, capable women are not contributing to the economy, an untapped potential that could significantly boost Sri Lanka's economic growth. ADB did a recent study, and in that it shows that barriers, including care responsibilities, restrictive social norms, and gaps in gender-responsive policies, continue to hold women back. Nothing seems to have changed. The cost of this exclusion, however, is immense, not only for women themselves, but for Sri Lanka's economic growth. So at a time when the country is striving for recovery and sustainable growth, and by unlocking women's potential, it is actually more a rule than an exception. It becomes desirable that we unlock women's full potential. Every percentage point increase in female labor force participation strengthens productivity, drives innovation, and creates a more inclusive society. So while warmly welcoming you to the Serendipity Knowledge Program series under the banner, Unlocking Women's Economic Potential in Sri Lanka, Barriers and Policy Pathways, organized by the Asian Development Bank, today is about turning those statistics into reality. And together, throughout this morning, we will explore pathways to ensure that women are not just present, but they are pivotal in shaping Sri Lanka's growth story. Just before I invite our first speaker to make the welcome address, I'd just like to remind you that the QR code and a link for Professor Dilani Gunawardana's Q&A, as well as for the panel discussion, that's on the table for you. And for the virtual participants, it is in the chat. So both the QR code and the link. So let's begin. I'd like to invite the Country Director for Sri Lanka of the Asian Development Bank, Ms. Shannon Collin, to make the welcome address.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that fabulous framing of our day. And good morning to all of you, officials of the government of Sri Lanka, distinguished resource persons, development partners, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 15th event under the Serendipity Knowledge Program, or SCOP, organized by ADB in partnership with the government, and my very first SCOP event as country director for ADB in Sri Lanka. ADB's work across Asia and the Pacific focuses on adding value that goes beyond funding for development challenges. This includes expert advice, forging collaborations, convening expertise from across our member countries, and catalyzing change through discussion and deliberation. It is in this context that we launched the Serendipity Knowledge Program in Sri Lanka to provide a platform to support knowledge solutions to Sri Lanka's challenges at this critical point in the country's history. Today's event focuses on a significant issue for Sri Lanka, which is persistently low female labor force participation, one of the lowest in South Asia, despite high educational attainment among women. While a lot of progress has been made in addressing gender equality challenges, Sri Lanka still ranks number 130 out of 148 countries in terms of gender equality, according to the World Economic Forum, and women's economic participation is one notable challenge. Numerous studies have been conducted to understand the reasons for low female labor force participation, and the factors shaping it are complex, layered, intersectional, and multidimensional. ADB recently contributed to the body of knowledge in this area through a study, which was initiated at the request of the National Planning Department of Sri Lanka and published at the end of last year. Today's event is anchored in the findings of this report, which highlights many barriers that still prevent women from fully participating in the workforce and contributing equally to the country's economic development. These findings include that many women remain concentrated in informal, low-paid, and insecure forms of work with limited social protection and few pathways for upward mobility. That social and cultural roles and expectations often assign women to primary caregiving and household duties, limiting career opportunities. That lack of affordable and accessible childcare makes it difficult for many mothers to work full-time or to combine income generation with other responsibilities. That unequal access to digital skills, technology, and information often creates new forms of exclusion for women, particularly those in rural and disadvantaged communities. That lack of safe workplaces and harassment reduce women's retention and career progression, and that safety concerns and limited transport options discourage women for traveling from work, especially during late hours and in rural areas. These are complex challenges that require action from diverse stakeholders, including the government, development partners, private sector, civil society, and academia. Empowering women to participate fully in the labor force is not only a matter of equality, rather it is essential for inclusive economic growth and lowering poverty in Sri Lanka. Ultimately, improving women's labor force participation requires more than isolated policy interventions. It calls for structural transformation, investments in infrastructure and services, progressive workplace practices, and a broader societal shift in how women's work, mobility, safety, and economic agency are understood and valued. The economy, too, must continue to grow at a pace that generates employment opportunities for women. This requires mobilizing investments in sectors with high growth potential and stimulating economic development in historically disadvantaged and lagging regions. ADB's country partnership strategy for Sri Lanka 2024 to 2028 notes that Sri Lanka's economic recovery offers an opportunity to advance gender equality and social inclusion by addressing deep-rooted structural barriers that impede progress. We are supporting policies and programs that increase women's access to education, skills, training, finance, employment opportunities, entrepreneurship, social protection, and infrastructure. ADB, through the projects and programs that we support, aims for more transformative change to address emerging challenges of gender equality and women's empowerment. I believe this timely knowledge dissemination and sharing event will contribute to this broader goal, generating takeaways that include both low-hanging fruits that can be acted upon immediately, as well as longer-term strategies and reforms necessary for sustained and meaningful change. I look forward to the insightful discussion today and hope it will generate useful takeaways for everyone. Thank you very much.
So, if this country is serious about economic growth, then it's time to get the full force of the women behind us. There is an opportunity here. Hold the thought for the rest of the morning and beyond. I'd like to invite now to make the keynote address the Professor of Sociology and Public Policy of the University of Toronto, Professor Ito Peng.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I hope you could hear me. Can you hear me? Yes? Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this very important knowledge sharing event. And thank you for your generous introduction. And also my apologies for not being there, not being able to attend the event in person. I am sort of zooming in from Toronto, Canada. So bear with me that as the time zone difference is pretty large between here and Colombo. First of all, I had a chance to read the report that will be presented by Dr. Delaney later on. The report that was developed by ADB and Dr. Delaney, Professor Delaney, exploring the factors behind low female labor force participation in Sri Lanka. And so, for my keynote address today, I would like to really talk a bit about my thoughts on this report and to share with you the situation and experiences of female labor force participation in other countries, in particular, Canada, Japan, and South Korea, the three countries that I really work quite extensively. So, first of all, I just want to say I would like to congratulate both ADB and Professor Delaney Gunawadera for this excellent report. I think you did a really great job explaining the factors behind low female labor force participation in Sri Lanka. I found the report very well written and the explanations quite understandable and convincing, even for a non-economist like myself. So thank you very much for the good job. And having said that, in reading the report, I was both surprised and not surprised to learn that the labor force participation rate of women in Sri Lanka is so low despite the quite high educational level. I was surprised because given the changes in women's labor force participation rate globally over the last several decades, including some of the countries in Asia, like the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea, the figure for Sri Lanka seemed noticeably lower compared to its comparators. So if you see the figure, and I wonder if you could share the file that I sent you. Thank you. Should I share? Could I share it? Oh, great. Next slide, please. Great. Okay. So if you see the figure here, you see that compared to countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Canada, women's labor force participation rate in Sri Lanka seems not only noticeably lower, but also it seems to have actually declined since 1990. Now, for me, this is really curious because even though female labor force participation rates in Asia might not be very high generally compared to, say, North America or Europe, they are in general on the increase over the last few decades rather than on the decline. So looking at sort of the case of Sri Lanka, where the labor force participation rate was something like 45% back in 1990, now it's around 31, 32% in 2025. This is quite curious and strange because if you look at the labor force participation rate of Japan, it had increased from the 50% in 1990 to 56% in 2025. And in South Korea, it increased quite sharply from 47% in 1990 to 57% in 2025. So looking at these figures, I would think that from social, economic, and policy point of view, this is really not good, and we must try to address this quite urgently. So, as the report pointed out, it would be really important to address this if we really want to support Sri Lanka's social and economic development. And so, on this, let me now say a bit about the situation and experiences of some of other countries, in particular Canada, Japan, and South Korea, and and explain some of the factors that might have contributed to the increase in female labor force participations in these countries. So I think you could sort of stop sharing the figure unless you want to keep it there. Um, I think there are a couple of important factors or reasons that made the increases in female labor force participations in Canada, Japan, and South Korea possible. The first is the public and government recognition of care responsibilities and unpaid care work that's been done by women in these countries. And by recognizing those, these country governments have actively implemented active policies to reduce women's unpaid care work. So, for example, in the case of Japan, the government realized back in early 1990s that they really needed to implement more active work-family harmonization policies to reduce women's unpaid care work. So in 1992, the Japanese government started its work-family harmonization policy by implementing such things as parental leaves, subsidized child care programs, and continue to expand them afterwards by increasing the wage replacement rate for parental leaves and by expanding public child care services until they made child care program, well, pretty much universal and very accessible in that country. And when Germany introduced its long-term care insurance program in 1995, they introduced it to provide care for older people. Japanese government actually studied that model very carefully and introduced its own universal long-term care insurance system in 2000. So as a result, by early 2000s, Japan had both universal child care and long-term care systems to help reduce women's unpaid care work and to reduce women's care burden. Of course, having said that, the Japanese government was compelled and incentivized to provide these progressive and positive social care for both children and older people, not only because they realized that family care burden was a key contributing factor for the low female labor force participation. They were also, of course, compelled and incentivized to do this because they realized that the family care burden was really contributing to Japanese women, decision to postpone marriage, and if married, not having children or have only one child, which in turn further contributed to the country's low fertility rate and then aging population. So the Japanese government was doing this sort of not just sort of in a kind of way to just support women's labor force participation rate, but also realizing that low labor force, that care burden was also intersecting with its own future demographic shift that would be very critical for the country's economic growth and development. Well, similar things also happened in South Korea as well, except only about 10 years later. South Korean government also realized that their total fertility rate was declining actually rather rapidly, largely because of women's unpaid care burden contributing to women, and particularly well-educated women, to postpone marriage and not to have children, even if they marry. So, as you know, the Korean women's total fertility rate is now something like less than 1.0. This is really critical for the Korean government in terms of in terms of its demographic and economic planning. So, like Japan, the implications of low fertility rate means in turn contributed to a very rapid aging population in South Korea. So starting in the early 2000s, the Korean government, learning from the Japanese experience, began to introduce and expand affordable child care systems. And by 2006, Korean government also introduced public mandatory long-term care insurance system. So in both cases, Japan and South Korea, these universal child care and long-term care policies for the older people actually helped reduce women's unpaid care work, and that in turn helped raise women's labor force participation. But having said that, I should say childcare and long-term care policies are not the only factors that contributed to increase in women's labor force participation. Another very important policy necessary to help support women's labor force participation is, in fact, employment policy. So let me now give you example or case of Canada, Japan, and South Korea. In the case of Canada, both the federal and provincial governments began to realize the issue of women's low labor force participation rate back in 1980s, and really wanted to encourage, support women's increasing women's labor force participation. So both the federal and provincial government began to introduce first Employment Equity Act in the 1980s. What it did was mandated employers to eliminate barriers to employment for women, Indigenous people, racialized people, and people with disability. Canada being a very multicultural country, sort of eliminating barriers to these different groups of people were really important. In some provinces like Ontario, where I live, the provincial government also began to implement what they called equal wage for work of equal value policy. What it tried to do was to equalize wages of work that are mainly done by women, such as care work, right? Nursing, care work, and social care, and those done by men, such as construction work, by trying to arguing that these work are work of equal values, and therefore we need to provide equal wage for work of equal values. So in the case of Canada, these policies played a very important role in helping raise women's labor force participation rate, because it tried to address not only women's care issues, but employer gender bias in hiring and in wage disparities between men and women. I could say that similar things also happened in Japan and South Korea. In Japan, the government introduced Equal Employment Opportunity Act in 1985 and continued to update and revise it to prohibit gender discrimination in recruitment, hiring, and promotion by employers. In Korea, the government also introduced Equal Employment Opportunity and Work-Family Balance Assistance Act in 1990s, which prohibited employers to discriminate against women in recruitment, hiring, and promotion. So these are the kind of bundle of policies that provided, in addition to the care policies, the kind of employment policy reforms. Now, this is not to say that these equal employment policies have completely eliminated employer discrimination against women. But I could say that these policies and regulations have definitely made employers much more mindful of gender equality and to change their behaviors. So what is important here is that having policies and regulations like these are important because it commits employers, not just the government, but employers to work in coordinating with each other to support, coordinating with the government to support women's employment and to ensure gender equality. And by doing this, I think through practice, it also changes government, employers, and household behaviors, and in the long run, also social and cultural norms about gender. So I know I just have a few minutes left. So in conclusion, I think to support and help raise women's labor force participation that is so much needed in the case of Sri Lanka, and hopefully in the process achieve greater gender equality, we will need positive policies to build effective care systems for children and for older adults. And as well, we need strong employment policies and regulations to eliminate employer discriminations against women and to ensure equal wages for work of equal value. I think the silver lining behind this is that these policies will not only increase gender equality, but in the long run will really change the social norms and cultural norms about gender and the way we do our work. And moreover, it is actually economically positive for the country. So I would like to just congratulate ADB and Professor Delaney Gunawardena again for the excellent report. I think this is a really important start for policymakers, NGO actors, and other stakeholders to really think about concrete actions to help support and raise women's labor force participation rate in Sri Lanka. And I think that I will end my address here. Yeah, I wish I'm afraid it is about 12:40 in the morning in midnight in Toronto. So I may have to sign off soon, but really great to be participating in this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peng. And we do appreciate that you have been up until midnight to do this keynote address. One of the policies, one of the takeaways from your conclusion is that we have to start with policy reform on care, on discrimination, harassment in workplace, and also to make workplaces more inclusive and enable women to be able to give off their best. So thank you very much. So Professor Peng also spoke about the findings of the study, alluded to the findings of the study, which she had gone through. So we're now going to call on the author of that study, Professor Dileni Gunawardena, who's a professor of economics at the University of Peradeniya. And she will give you the findings, explore the factors behind low female labor force participation in Sri Lanka. Just a reminder, that while Professor is giving the findings of the study, please do use the QR code and the link on your table, and also what comes up on the chat for virtual participants to ask any questions which will from Dr. Dileni, which will follow straight after her findings. Professor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. Thank you, Savitri, for the introduction, and Professor Peng for that, for agreeing to be the speaker today, and for staying up, and for that very helpful and insightful introduction to this event today. So I will try to be as brief as is possible covering this report. And starting off, as Professor Peng introduced us as well, with the fact that Sri Lanka's labor force participation is quite low, given the global average and given, our education rates, and the fact that there is a huge potential to be gained for the economy if this gap is closed. So if you take the Sri Lankan paradox, it's the paradox of high educational attainment and low female labor force participation. 3 points there: girls outnumber boys in secondary and tertiary education enrollment, and gender parity exists in primary school enrollment. Now, the point I want to make here is really Sri Lankan education is free, even at the tertiary level. So the taxpayer is investing money in educating people, and we know that education is for life, but education is also for the economy to, have a productive workforce. And so the taxpayer is really losing out when 2/3 of 1/2 of the population, of the educated population, is not joining the labor force. And that's really an economic question. And it's a question for governments to think about as to whether they really are getting the return on their investment to education if it's not going that full life cycle, economic cycle journey. So the second is simply the fact of low female labor force participation, which we talked about. And the third is the huge economic cost. And this figure actually has been mentioned in numerous reports, bulletins, and so on. And the origin, I believe, is from a paper by Kuberez and Tigner, which is there in the footnote. And it's been cited by the IMF. So if the Treasury says the IMF has no money to support women's labor force participation, the IMF themselves have said that there is a 21% loss to GDP, or there could be a 21% boost to GDP if gender equality were achieved. So the study design and methodology of this report is really twofold. The first part was a literature review that I undertook of sort of most of the recent, when I say recent, the last 10 years, work that has been done. And I'm glad to see that many of the authors, to use Dr. Gunatilaka's phrase, the usual suspects, of which he is one, are here in this room today. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting panel discussion after this. And then I do a brief trend analysis. I'll present a conceptual framework. I use the Women Business and Law Index and the report results to talk about legislative gaps. And then finally, I end with international best policy practices for policy benchmarking. The sort of heart of the report is the new empirical analysis that I did. And this was using the LFS 2019 data set. And the question might arise, why 2019? So this report was actually begun about 2 years ago. And at that time, I think 2020, 2021 might have been available, but 2019 was the last period for which we had data before COVID. And as it turns out, before the economic crisis. So in some ways, this is telling us what the sort of stable underlying structural situation is with regard to women's labor force participation. So yes, things must have changed, but this is what it was there in 2019. And the other advantage was that I supplemented it with HIS 2019 and DHS 2016 for district level data. Something this report does, which I think is a departure from sort of previous work by Dr. Gunatilaka and also by Pratibhashi Seniviratna and others who have used this kind of methodology to analyze female labor force participation, is that I looked at 3 separate groups: ever married women between the ages of 25 and 64, estate sector women. So I separated out the estate sector, and then young women age 15 to 24. And the reason for this really comes from some of the work that's been done by others, which shows really that these are distinct groups. So some of the answer to the question that Professor Peng posed in the previous speech is that the composition of the labor force has also changed. So younger women in the age 15 to 24 age group are staying in school longer. So they're not in the labor force for a good reason. Married women are the majority. Married women between 25 and 64, that's the majority of the female labor force. And the estate sector, with its higher female labor force participation rates, is quite different. So it makes no sense to put them all together because then, the results get confused. And so that was the reason to separate these 3 groups. So what I do is mainly a multivariate regression with district effects. I look not only at what influences labor force participation, but what influences different types of employment, or being employed or unemployed. So that basically, what is the likelihood of a woman being in formal employment? What is the likelihood of a woman being in formal public employment? What's the likelihood of a woman being an employee? What's the likelihood of a woman being self-employed? And what's the likelihood of a woman being a contributing family worker? And so on. Because there's different types of employment when you're employed. And then, if you're unemployed, again, we look a little bit at that, especially among the young. Okay. So I think given what Professor Peng just said, I want to talk about this a little bit. And this is really the conceptual framework for female labor force participation. We've got labor supply factors. And very often, when public policy is designed about getting women into work, it's focusing on women's skills, right? So talking about women and employment is almost always just talking about women's skills. But when we look at the decision that households make as to whether women should work or not, there's not just their skills, but also the other things they do, right? Housework, childcare, and then other households' income. Because we've got in Sri Lanka, as we will see, a breadwinner model, right? So if you have a man in the house, there's no need for the woman to work, right? And then social cost, so stigma, mobility norms, things like that. And then on the other side, we have demand side factors that affect whether a woman decides to work or not. So if she's going to face a lower wage for the same kind of work as a man, right? Or perhaps as her husband, it makes much more sense for the husband then to go to work than for her. Comparative advantage. So if she's, if her wage is lower than the wage of the man, again, it will make sense for the man to work than for the woman to work. And then the work environment, flexibility, harassment, other opportunities for women to get promoted, to be trained, and so on, and location. And as Professor Ping pointed out, labor market policies have a huge impact on these factors, especially the factors of labor demand. And labor market policies interact with social norms, but social norms themselves can be influenced by labor market policies. So my study doesn't unpack everything, but it gives you a sort of description of what's going on. So if you look at Sri Lanka's labor force participation from, just before independence, one of the huge boosts to the female labor force participation was free education. And at the same time, as you had a supply of women getting educated, you also had the government hiring women to be teachers, to be nurses, to be doctors, and so on. And so you had, with the expansion of education and health services in the 50s and 60s, you had this upward trend. And then with economic liberalization, you had, you had women joining, especially the garment industry, but other industries in the 1980s. And then post-1990, we have this stagnation. So actually, as Professor Peng pointed out, this decline and then stagnation, right? And what's very interesting also is that post-1990, we are comparing like with like. Since 1990, the DCS has been publishing quarterly labor force, has been conducting quarterly labor force surveys, and they're pretty much comparable with a few, changes here and there. So what happened, right? And as I said, part of this is composition, that age has changed, and that has affected this stagnation. But what else is going on, right? And then after the crisis, we see that the participation rate fell to 32%, right? Okay, so the regression part of the study really comes up with one very powerful enabler, and that is education, right? And basically, if you have A-levels or a degree, the likelihood of your participating in the labor force is pretty high. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Part of it is that then you're able to earn something that makes it worthwhile working in the labor force. The actual costs as related to, the benefits as versus the costs are positive. There's also, with education, presumably you have a little bit more agency, you're able to, do what you be able to have a say in whether you work or not. And then the third factor is that with education, you're also able to access, decent work, right? So all of this is happening with education. And some of the other numbers here, there's 160% more chance of being able to enter government employment if you have A-levels, right? There's a 45% more likely chance of being in private formal employment with each year beyond A-level. But only 16 to 18% of women in Sri Lanka had completed A-levels in 2019. And then only 4 to 5% had a degree or other tertiary qualification. The primary constraint is caregiving. I think this is now clear to most of us that caregiving has been a huge constraint on female labor force participation. And these figures kind of break it down a little bit. So there is a 57% reduction in female labor force participation with a child under 6 in the household, which you can see in that first column, right? What's also interesting is that if you have a girl child between 6 and 10 years of age, that still also is a constraint. And if you, at 11:30 or 1:30, if you look at the roads, you see the reason why, right? Because the mothers are out there bringing their kids home from school, right? Girls need to be protected. And so you need a mother at home to be there when this girl comes home. Yeah. There's also a slight effect, slight but significant effect, on having older people in your household and older males. This isn't significant for females, but it's significant for males, right? And then having a person with a disability reduces the likelihood of being in the labor force by about almost 20%. Right? Looking at the other figures on the right there, the likelihood of formal private employment with a child under 6 reduces by almost 100%, right? The third figure is the time that women spend daily more than men on unpaid domestic activities and caregiving activities, right? And it's start because I would like to spend a little time with that. And that actually works out to 62 more days per year than men that women spend in unpaid care and unpaid domestic care, domestic work and child work. And this is just calculated from multiplying the 4.1 by 365 and then, dividing it by sort of the 24 and so on. But what's really interesting is actually if we consider that, people sleep, right? So if we just take an 8-hour day of care, right? Women actually work 187 days, work days, right? 8-hour days than men in a year. 62 24-hour days, but 187 8-hour days, right? Which is 8.5 months. So if you're an employer out there looking for women to hire, just keep in mind they're already doing another job. And so that's your answer, right? This is why they're not available to join the labor force. So I'll take us back to the previous slide. people have, I saw somewhere on social media, I think in relation to this event, there was a comment that said, this is not counted. The value of this is not counted. So actually we have, with a colleague at Verita Research, we valued this. And we came up with a number, which is 14% of GDP. So this unpaid for 4 more hours, but the work that men and women do is 14% of GDP. And the work that women do is 12% of GDP. So men contribute 2% of GDP in terms of unpaid work, and women contribute a value of 12% of GDP in unpaid work. So going back to the report and the results, several things came up. One is that there is this income effect, right? That when you have higher male earnings, women are less likely to enter formal self-employment. And that's confirming that we do have this breadwinner norm, right? Educated spouses further reduces women's informal and family work. And widowed or separated women are more likely to participate because economic necessity overrides norms. So what we have in Sri Lanka, in this 32% of women who are working or in the labor force, is that many of them are there by necessity, right? So we have sort of 2 groups of women, the ones who are there by necessity, and then the ones who've got enough skills to be able to access decent work and to be actually then, and good wages, and to be actually working. Right? Marriage restricts employment to a narrow occupational range, especially for less educated women. Higher adult male share in the household lowers female labor force participation by 18 to 21%. And there's a very small but significant relationship between the district domestic violence rate coming out of the DHS data and female labor force participation, right? So basically that's proxying for sort of a culture that is patriarchal, and it seems to make it more likely that you have difficulty participating, right? So 70%, I'll just focus on the last figure there, 70% of married women with a child, less than 6 actually, 5 or less, are not participating in waged work. And that's not a surprise. And finally, labor demand, right? So district male unemployment, which is gives you an indication of how much labor demand there is in the district, is negatively related with female labor force participation. So what it's saying really is that if jobs are tight even for men, then the likelihood of women being able to participate is quite low, right? And if the district share of higher education is high, also women's participation is low. And this can be for a variety of reasons, right? But it can also mean that we are not generating enough jobs for people with high education. And so in terms of growing the economy, we really have to look at encouraging investment in high-skilled work. So that, that will then create jobs that women will be happy to access. Whereas with trades, manufacturing, and agriculture, there is a higher chance of working. So then looking at the estate sector, as I said, it's a different sector. And the difference is really more stark in simply averages between the estate sector and the urban and rural sectors put together, right? Participation rate is higher, A-level completion is lower, digital literacy is lower, English literacy is lower, vocational training is lower, right? And the primary employer is a plantation company, whereas in the others, it's the government or the private sector. And the dominant occupation in urban and rural is mixed, including white collar, but in the estate sector, it's agricultural labor. Now, what I want to point out here is this is taking areas that are still designated as estates. So you could come from an estate background, get education, move out of the estate into the city with a high-paying job. And you wouldn't be then counted as estate anymore, right? So it's not saying that there isn't individual mobility in the estate sector, but it is just saying that we still have this sector where we're very happy that there's a high rate of female labor force participation, but really it's, under difficult circumstances, which have been sort of described in journalistic accounts and as well as serious academic accounts. But that's the situation with the estate sector. What's also interesting, and this has been happening for probably close to a century, is that the estate sector provides childcare. So there's creches. We know it's of varying quality. It's been hard to pin down what underlies the causes of this varying quality. Sometimes it's management, sometimes it's just a person. But basically, that's been kind of the situation with the estate sector. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Just talk briefly about young women. And with young women, the labor force participation rate is low. It's 22%. And of that, really, the main reason is because they're still in education and training, right? Unemployment is high. And the one thing that helps them to get more access to jobs is digital access. Then very quickly, the crisis, so this is from the literature, the crisis widened the gender gap in participation. We had in 2019, the Easter Sunday attacks. In 2020-21, we had the COVID pandemic. In 2022, we had the economic crisis and the default. And then post-economic crisis, we've had, brain drain and migration. So among all of that, a sort of general idea has been that the gap has widened. So talking about policy implications, there are 4 policy implications that are presented in this report. Upskilling women and girls. And I want to say the reason I put it first is not because it's necessarily the most important. Maybe it's to get it out of the way, but really because what the data is showing is that if you're a woman and you want to access good work, you really have to get yourself educated, get good skills, and then you'll be able to get into decent work, formal work, where you'll be remunerated reasonably close to what you're worth. The second one is enhancing workforce participation. The third one is fostering inclusive policies. And then the fourth one is shifting policy norms. So in terms of upskilling, there are 4 areas that we've suggested. One is extend compulsory schooling to A-level completion, right? The second is improve digital access, digital literacy and English, right? I think in the interest of time, I'll pick up some of this during the discussion. The third is expand and strengthen vocational training. So this is for those who don't go on to A-levels, that they can also have skills that are certified and that are in demand. Promote women in STEM. The second one is care infrastructure. And there are several suggestions here, but they relate to childcare, elder care or long-term care, and care for persons with disabilities. So some of the state actions that could be done is to enforce and expand the maternity benefits ordinance, right? I think the National Child Daycare Policy has now been passed. Yeah? And on the part of employers, on-site or partnered childcare facilities, subsidized childcare benefits, caregiver leave, and employer assistance programs are some of the things that we talked about. In terms of state action, subsidizing home-based and adult care services, especially in rural areas, because the market will address the needs of the urban affluent sector. But we really need to think about beyond those who can afford to pay. And also in terms of sort of more remote areas where it's not really worth the market's while to expand into these areas. What are the models that we can look at? Should we look at elder care centers? Should we look at home visits? There are several models that are out there, and this is something that we need to look at. Then regulatory reform. I'll take a minute to wrap up. So maternity costs. And this is suggesting that we move the maternity costs to the state rather than the employer, or rather that the state or the taxpayer in the end subsidizes maternity costs in order to encourage employers to hire women. Because maternity benefits are great, but they are also a huge incentive for employers to hire women. And another option, which is mentioned there, is introduce mandatory paternity leave. And one thing that the government can do is to introduce mandatory paternity leave in the public sector, right? And then, see how that goes in terms of at least changing norms. Strengthening anti-harassment enforcement. I think recently we've seen the courts being very firm and strong on this, and that's really a very good sign. But this is something that needs to be supported with laws as well. Prohibit discriminatory hiring practices. It's now possible for employers to ask you, are you married, when, or to even advertise in terms of gender, to ask you how many children you're planning to have, right? And it's very simple and costless to just simply pass a law that says you cannot ask such questions at a job interview, right? Legalize and regulate flexible work. So working from home sounds wonderful, is not always possible for the people at the bottom end of the workforce. And then reform pension and gratuity rules so that the time that women take away from work in order to have kids is not penalized when their pensions are calculated. Right? Then increasing aggregate demand, particularly in high growth sectors, in sectors where we have actually a skilled female labor force. Wage subsidies and minimum wages. The minimum wage tends to bind for women. Because if you look at the informal sector, women are always paid less than men, right? You hire a man to clean your garden. You hire a woman to cook and clean your house. There's at least a 50% difference there, right? And if you have a minimum wage that is declared and that binds, right? Currently, the minimum wage for Sri Lanka, if I'm not mistaken, is 600 rupees. I don't think anybody in this room pays 600 rupees to a woman that they hire to cook daily for them, right? So if we have a minimum wage that actually binds, it will be the women who are supported. And then formalize informal employment, which will help, especially own account women. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through. I hope some of this can be picked up in the discussion. Shifting social norms. So I think social norms can be changed by policies that are pro-women. Social norms can also be changed by campaigns, by gender-responsive budgeting, by employers. Employers have a huge role in social norms, introducing unconscious bias training, being transparent, celebrating gender equal employers, female representation on board. And then civil society has, again, a huge role to play in terms of advocating for policies, paid parental leave reform, partnering on norm change programs with evidence-based measurement, supporting women's organized networks in the areas where labor force participation is lower, and then documenting and publicizing stories of women who have overcome barriers. And I would like to say here also on men who are changing norms, so that it's not the alpha male that is, promoted, but the idea that men who are caregivers, men who support women in the workforce are also celebrated and not looked down on. Special focus is on lifting up women in the estate sector, closing the gender gap, which is happening, but still needs work, digital inclusion, performance-based wages, representation, and voice, especially women, being the majority of the workforce, need to be the ones who represent themselves rather than men. Disability care support, and then transport and mobility. I'm sorry, I'm rushing. Much there. Who needs to act? But we can see that there are at least 5 categories of actors there. Parliament and national ministries have roles to play. Provincial council and local government, especially I think in lobbying for expenditure on care, on infrastructure, so that this will make it more working woman friendly environment. So the conclusion is that GDP can grow by 21%. This is an IMF endorsed number. 4 pillars of reform are education, care, inclusive policy, and norms. The time to act is now. And we need data so that we can, this is based on labor force data, which we have regularly, but some of the care-related information is from time use data, which is now almost 10 years old. So it's time for us to invest in data sets that give us a greater understanding of the constraints that prevent women from participating in the labor force.
Eleni, that was a marathon run. It's a lot to digest in a very short time. But one of the things you did mention was that women with a higher level of education have more chances of, or do get into the female labor force and remain there, rather than those with the mid-level education or low-level education. What can we do to strengthen those with a mid-level education, their ability to be absorbed into the female labor force participation and be included in an equitable way?
So I'm going to double check that I understood. The question is, what can we do for women without education?
No,
with
mid-level education.
Mid-level. Okay. So mid-level actually, and this was actually the first time I met the Prime Minister. She made the remark. She was, at a workshop like this, talking about education. And she talked about, at that time, there was this myth that education was keeping people out of, education was, educated people were unemployed because, they didn't want to do menial work. And she pointed out that when we said educated people, we're talking about people at O levels. And so I think at O levels, vocational training is one way to go. And the other way to go, I think, is also encouraging them to stay in school by making the curriculum interesting, by improving the quality of education, of course. So those are the two things I can think of.
So, is there evidence from Sri Lanka on the relationship between women's participation in economic activities and their vulnerability to violence, either at home or in the community?
So, there have not been, to the best of my knowledge, sort of deep studies done on this. There have been studies done on this in other countries. The World Bank has published several. I'm aware of studies done in Colombia. In Sri Lanka, what this showed up was, because we don't have the data, what this showed was that if you took the district level, variation in intimate partner violence, then what happens to the likelihood of women participating? And in other countries, there are studies that have shown, for example, if you're supporting women in self-employment by giving them credit, that might sort of lead to their husbands beating them. So other countries, yes, I'm not aware of anything in Sri Lanka.
So, again, we have an aging population. How can women's labor force participation, particularly women's ability to earn as they grow older, again, be strengthened and to reduce dependence and support on their current partner's economic income or whatever it is like that?
So I think the aging population is a huge bomb that we have not really quite grasped the significance of. I think in our personal lives, because everybody has parents, we understand this, but it's a huge sort of constraint in terms of women's labor force participation, because we've thought very much in terms of families will look after their parents. And what we have to do is really understand how families are doing this. And once we understand what they're doing and how they're coping, I think we'll realize that government can step in. And then we've got to look for creative ways of stepping in, whether it is, care centers, whether it's home visits, sort of, like we have one of the unsung services that we have in Sri Lanka at the other end of the spectrum is the public health midwife. If you look at across the country, the public health midwife does a fantastic job. And if we could have, I've long thought that if we could have something like that for elders, and maybe not just somebody who goes and advise. I'm aware that the Ministry of Health is running a pilot where they have, sort of nurses or people with nursing background training women in their homes how to look after their elders better, or how to look after their, people who are incapacitated better. But I think we need to go a little bit more and have somebody. Professor Peng and I were in the field last week, actually, and she asked a couple of women, how would you feel if somebody came and, and they said, did what? And she said, whatever you want, cook, clean, take your husband who's had a stroke out for a walk, something like that. How would you like that? And of course, everybody said, if it's free, we'd love it. And the question she followed up with was, what would you do if you had that opportunity? And the responses were really interesting. In some in the case of some people, they would take that opportunity perhaps to go and do some work or to be, she said in other countries, she found that many people said they would like to get a skill so that they can work. One woman actually said she would use that time to meditate, bhavana karan, because she needed some space for herself as well.
So it brings me to my next question. Cultural barriers. You spoke about having someone look after your elderly parents or aged care homes. Sri Lankans don't want to put their parents into homes. They are also very reticent when it comes to having other people look after them, because what will the neighbors say? What will my relatives say? How do we get out of that huge barrier, given that these have come down generations in a time where we had plenty of help? Now we can't. Women take that burden on and they just keep going. That's one of the reasons we can't get them into the labor force. How do we do that? Change the mindset, not only on aged parents, but in generally change mindset.
Absolutely. I think you're right, not just in terms of aged parents, but putting children in childcare, putting children in preschool. I'm not sure whether I mentioned that, mandating preschool education is also a proposal I've made. How do you change that? I think there are sort of two types of people. There are households, and I use the word household knowing that there are different people inside the household. But there are households where that's an option and they can afford to do it. And they choose not to do it because they think it's, the duty of the daughter or the daughter-in-law to do that. And I think that is something that, will change with time. And also with circumstances, because people in that middle generation are dying, perhaps of stress, more than older generation, right? I mean, it happened to my mother. She died before my grandmother. And then we were forced to put my grandmother in a care home, because otherwise it meant that my sister would have to stay home and look after her. And that was not something that, as a family, we were willing to go with. But there are also other people who just, even putting their parent in a home is not an option. And I think that's the vast majority of the country. And I think that's where this idea of home visits, sort of care infrastructure, and you will find they are much more receptive to the idea. They are doing it because they have to, because there aren't options. But I think the time will come when it will just, it will be a bomb. And, in crises, people make changes that they don't do in normal time.
In doing this study, what are the most surprising things you found out?
I think this domestic violence, even though it was a tiny little thing, right? It's not, the impact is not large, but the significance was very strong. So that was sort of a surprising thing. I shouldn't have been surprised, but the fact that the gender of whom the care recipient is mattered. The fact that girls, it made it more likely that if you had girls, labor force participation would be less. And older men, again, I have heard people sort of say in conversation that when men retire, there's really nothing for them to do. Women are still, active as they're active in unpaid birth. For men, there isn't that much for them to do. And so that impacts how other people's labor force participation decisions are made.
Just in conclusion, is there any model or a few models maybe anywhere else in the world that we can start putting into place for this policy, mindset change, lots of things to ensure that we get our women into the workforce?
Yes. So in terms of childcare, India has the Anganwadi system, which has been there, for a long time. And that's a sort of it sort of encompasses child nutrition, childcare, all of that. And I suspect that some of our creches have borrowed from that. And I think that's, modifying it to the Sri Lankan situation, definitely that could be something for childcare. For elder care, the idea of these home visits, and sometimes you have to borrow from countries that, I remember once suggesting something in a forum like this, and people said, now you're talking about first world solutions. I said, if you have first world problems, you have to have first world solutions. But so I think in the US, they have this home visit idea. I'm borrowing from a colleague at Verite who told me about this, where you have 3 people. One is, somebody who will, I think, do care. The other might be somebody who does sort of cooking and cleaning and so on. The third is a handyman, because as parents get older, there are, ramps for wheelchairs and all sorts of things that need to be done. And so if we could have maybe a service like that, definitely contextualized for Sri Lanka, but that's something to, I think about.
Thank you so much. Lots of gems in there, and I wish we had a little more time, but I'm sure the panel discussion will delve deeper into what we were discussing. Thank you, Teleni. So as mentioned, panel discussion comes through now. Just a reminder, if there is a QR code and a link on the table, please do post your questions via the QR code and the link. And for those who are watching us virtually, there is a link in the chat that you can click on and get questions. So the panel discussion is enabling women's labor force participation in Sri Lanka. I would like to invite your moderator and facilitator, Ms. Ketevan Sheze, Gender Specialist, Gender Equality Division of the ADB, and our speakers one by one. Mr. Anup Satpathy, Wage Specialist for South Asia at the ILO. Dr. Ramani Gunatilaka, Independent Consultant. Ms. Rupika Ranavaka, Commissioner of Labor, Labor Standards Division, Department of Labor. Tanuja Jayawardena, Head of Gender Equity DEI and Code of Conduct, MAS Holdings. And Ms. Upulka Samarakon, Vice President Human Resources of John Kills Holdings PLC. Over to you, Ketama.
Can you hear me? Yes. Very good morning. I hope you had lots of insights from our professors sharing local as well as international context and good practices and a lot of challenges. And we will be unpacking some of those now during our panel. And we have a very impressive lineup of speakers, as you can see. But I want to start with a story. Imagine a young woman who excels at school, graduates university with honors, but a few years later, she's not in the labor market. It's not that she's not talented or lacks ambition, but for her, there is no childcare that is accessible and affordable. Commuting is not safe, and the work environment is neither secure for her. So this is a lost talent, lost productivity, not only for her, but for an economy. And we live in this reality. And this is in particular the case for Sri Lanka, where we see very high education level of women that we heard a lot about it this morning. So keeping this in mind, And also the fact that we heard this morning how women's labor force participation stays stagnant during the last several years, if not a decade. Why is this paradox? Perhaps, I know it's a broader question, but perhaps we can start with this. And I would like to ask Professor Ramani to help us a little bit, delve in depth as much as possible, but help us understand maybe and put on the table some of the topics. Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't expect to go first in a daydream. First, thank you, Delaney. That was an excellent presentation. And I particularly like the way you separated out the group, because once you put everybody and everything in a regression, you lose a lot of the nuance in the analysis. I have to say, I don't quite agree with Professor Ito. She was talking about really advanced countries, advanced industrial economies, which generated the jobs through their industrial transformation and pulled women into the workforce. We have never been in that fortunate situation other than, and here I think your chart is very revealing. 77 liberalization. There was a bump there which was not sustained. And then in 2019, I think that was some kind of statistical artifact. Probably a temporary added worker effect caused by the Easter bomb. Because otherwise, why was it not sustained? The economy was declining. Economic growth was declining before that. So for women's participation to suddenly bump up, it wasn't normal. So I think the key thing here is growth. We have had growth, but most of that growth has been pumped by fiscal spending, not in terms of job creation. And that puts us in a different category altogether. Aging population, no growth, getting old before we get rich or even able to manage this. And I think, Delaney, some of your findings really, although it's based on household data, it shows this. For example, right, you said that if jobs are tight for men, female labor force participation is not going to grow. So that comes out of the household data analysis. Also, I would question your 4 pillars, in fact, because 4 pillars suggest that these are equally important. Whereas I would say the most important pillar which has been missing, and our population has got old while this was lacking, and we may have missed several opportunities. That's the growth pillar. And if we want to move the rate of female labor force participation, there's no other way rather than increasing the rate of growth, and not through fiscal spending, through structural industrial transformation, which never really happened here. So I think that is the elephant in the room. And in a way, the focus on household data, it is very useful, but in a way, it confines us to just issues related to the household, whereas the real problem, I would say, is elsewhere. And that is in the macroeconomic environment. So I think I mean, I could go on forever. I will stop here and maybe intervene again if necessary.
Thank you very much for your reflections, and we'll be touching some of these topics more in depth. I would like now to ask Srupika We heard a lot about policies and also heard examples of other countries. So in your opinion and experience, what are some of the most critical measures, policy measures in strengthening women's labor force participation? Of course, in the context of Sri Lanka. No.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to give our sincere thanks for inviting the Department of Labor to this important forum. And the research you had done, which I was also a respondent, was marvelous. And I think it had covered a lot of areas and the barriers, everything was there. When it comes to labor policy, first we have to think whether we have a labor policy in Sri Lanka. I would like to say, even as a member, an official of the Department of Labor, we don't have a policy like thing, a documented policy. But we have a labor laws, more than 100 different labor laws, but we practice only about 13 labor enactments. So, and the other thing is that it is so complicated and outdated. So the Sri Lanka has the government and the department and the ministry with the international advice and the guidance from ILO and the international labor standards. We have even thought of revising the labor law. And I would like to explain a little on the labor laws because it's my subject. And the most commonly applicable labor laws are the Shop and Office Employees Act, Wages Board Employees Ordinance, Wages Board Ordinance. We have 40 odd enactments and we have 44 wages boards. See how complicated it is. And now we are into the process of simplifying these labor laws and making all the laws understandable to all the general employees, not only the educated people, to the employees in the informal sector. The labor law is mostly guided by the ILO regulations, the standards, and it has been developed over the period. And when it comes to female labor force participation, the laws related to females in the private and semi-government sector are the Maternity Benefits Ordinance, Shop and Office Employees Act, and when it comes to the public sector, we have E-Code. So the international recommendations are to make equality and more inclusiveness and practice fair practices. But when it comes to maternity only, we have a lot of disparities. So we have to remove that. As Professor Delaney suggested, we will have to shift to a socially maintained fund. That has been given thought by the Ministry of Labor and the Department of Labor, and there are discussions with the ILO as well to ratify ILO Convention 183. So we are into the process of making these females into the labor force. And Professor Delaney stated about Minimum Wages Act, National Minimum Wages Act was brought in 2016. Before that, we had wages board mechanism only for setting minimum wages. We are setting the minimum wage, but not the maximum or the ceiling. The employer, if employer is willing to give more and more benefits, more salaries, the employer is free to do that. And in 2016, the national minimum wage for a month was 10,000. And in 2017, it was raised to 12,500. And in 2021, it was brought to 17,500. And in 2025, with the national the government decision to uplift the increase the public sector salaries and aligning, going with the policy, the national minimum wage was revised again. The enactment is the amended act is number 11 of 2025. With that, by 2025 April, the national minimum wage for a monthly earned person was brought to 27,000. And with the same enactment, it was made a statutory provision that the employees in the private sector should get 30,000 by January 2026. That is the national minimum wage at present. And the daily minimum wage is 1,200. And, but the problem comes there, because we have daily wage and the monthly wage, but no hourly rate. Anup is always coming to the ministry and the department and asking us to, pressing us to go for a hourly rate and align with the geographical location as well. So the department and the ministry has given thoughts, and in the process, at the moment, the Commissioner General of Labour and the Secretary to the Ministry and the ministers are attending International Labour Conference, Geneva, and they will take necessary steps to proceed with these amendments in a way that it will promote female labor force participation and also cover up informal sector. The 65% of the working population is in the informal sector. So we have a very big challenge that we have to cover that informal sector under these laws, because when it comes to labor law, we have to look at whether he's an employee. There should be employer-employee relationship. So most of the platform economies, the self-employees, the care workers at home, all those categories, the economically important categories have been left out by these labor laws. So sometimes we'll have to cover them with some other law, not definitely by the labor law, but by some other law. Like the maternity should be made socially, the government, the state-owned facility. Likewise, we'll have to think of ways how to cover those females in the informal other categories of work sectors. And Yeah, the plus points is that the other one is that the females are reluctant to go to a formal workplace because there could be sexual and gender-based violences. The government is, they are into that as well. The country has ratified Convention 190 in January this year, 2026. So the workplace place harassments and the violences will be addressed by the most probably the labor law, because still the law is there with the police. The females don't like to go to the police station to lodge their complaints or the grievances or whatever the problem they have. They don't like to go to the police because they are not familiar with that. So they would like to talk to the labor inspector or the labor department, and the department has a complaint management system which the employees or any person could lodge their complaint online. So they don't come to the need to come to the department, and those challenges, actually, those are challenges. The people don't like to go away and make a complaint. So they can lodge their complaint online, being at home. And the next thing is that we have to promote work from home concepts, those things. So we will need to not only labor law reforms, we will have to look at, as Professor Dileni clearly identified through the research as well, we'll have to develop the infrastructure, close by places for them to work. When they need to go to a place of work, and the demographic, the daycare centers and elder care centers at close proximity. Those supplies, the infrastructure should be there. Actually, it should be addressed by the government, not only the Department of Labor or the Ministry of Labor. We will have to work in collaboration. I know that the Women's Ministry is also here. The Women's Ministry has a very good action plan for combating sexual and gender-based violence. So those are the factors we have to address.
Thank you.
We are into it now.
Yes, thank you very much. And I know all of them are interconnected, but we will have a second round of questions. So please keep some of the points for later, but thanks for sharing. And one of the issues you mentioned are wages, and I think it's a good link to my next question, which is related to gender wage gap. And Mr. Anupi, you have extensive experience in this field. So if you could give us a current status of the gender wage gap and what are the factors shaping this picture? Thank you.
Thank you. And as far as the gender pay gap is concerned, already Professor Dileni has mentioned it in her action plan, and it was good that she did the gender pay gap report along with the Verite research for ILO in 2023. And that was the first evidence on gender pay gap in South Asia, concrete evidence. We had not done earlier in other countries, but that was the starting point. And then we did it in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and going forward this year in India, so that we'll have a South Asia mapping of the gender pay gap. As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, the gender pay gap, as estimated from the labor force survey data, stands around 27%, which means women in general and 20% less in an hour compared to men. And this is one of the compared to global average, which is around 20%, and the average here in Sri Lanka is high. And this is not a phenomenon of Sri Lanka because of the low labor force participation, large informal economy, the unequal distribution of paid care work across the region. In Pakistan, it is also around 25 to 30%. and around the similar levels also in Bangladesh, which is the report is going to be published soon. So this is a phenomena, and in the context of Sri Lanka, the data was with respect to 2021, but estimation was also made prior to that, and it was found that the gap is persistent, like labor force participation rate and the gap there between men and women is persistent and remains stagnant over time. The same also with respect to the gender pay gap. And most importantly, we are discussing about barriers and policy. And you would like to know that this gap between men and women is not explained by the general characteristics or observable factors. There would be pay gap if there is educational difference, the sector you are working, the job functions that you are working. But in the case of Sri Lanka, most of these pay gaps cannot be explained by differences in education skill or in terms of age and other kind of characteristics, and it is entirely unexplained. So that is the cause of concern, and therefore Professor Delaney was highlighting about lack of career progression and lack of respect for work of equal value. Men and women may be doing similar work or work of similar values, but they are paid differently. It is also due to occupational segregation. Women are in a particular occupation, which is again undervalued by the employer. So it is because of many reasons, including social norms, which promotes that women into more unpaid kind of care work. So it is the reasons are many. Also, the reasons could be that, as Professor Delaney pointed out, the maternity cost here in Sri Lanka is entirely on the employer. And you will find that women workforce participation rate also goes down during that particular age group. And therefore, that also has an implication on the pay gap. And another thing, Madam also suggested about the minimum wage policy of Sri Lanka. And if you'll notice that the national minimum wage does not cover domestic workers. So they are outside the coverage. That is the only one group which is outside the coverage. And if you want to draw inspiration, recently Indonesia, after a long struggle, has a separate legislation exclusively for domestic workers, and Philippines is the best case study in the region about wages for the domestic worker. So apart from these barriers, we found that the wage gap is particularly very high in the informal economy. As Madam was suggesting, there is no labor contract to establish employer and employee, and it is very high among the low-skilled and low-educated workers. So in that context, when we are talking about policy, then we need to see that because it is due to very many unexplained reasons, so the policy has to be a comprehensive approach. And in this comprehensive approach, as Sri Lanka is in the process of reforming its labor legislation, so we need to think whether we can promote flexible work, remote work, telework, so that we can promote at least, if not full-time, part-time work for the women and temporary work. And that has to be also seen that we do not have hourly wages, how hourly wages would also attract women to the workplace. And these hourly wages has not to be a pro rata wages, but at a higher level than the pro rata wages. And then Sri Lanka has ratified, as all of you know, the ILO's Equal Remuneration Convention, which is Convention 100. And it has also recently ratified ILO's Harassment Convention. So in terms of international ratifying international treaties and all, Sri Lanka has done very many steps, but the challenge is how to how to put that in the domestic legislation and implementation. And in that context, one could think of how pay transparency legislation can be included in the reform process in the Employment Act, how gender neutral job evaluation can be promoted at the enterprise level, and then how the maternity cost can be shared between employer and also by the government, family-friendly workplace policy, including flexible work arrangement. Also, we found in the study that most of the women are either at the lower end of the job market or at the medium. So there is lack of or underrepresentation of women in managerial and in high-paying position. So that is another issue that needs to be addressed. So it is a mix of very many policies, and this is the right time as Sri Lanka is reforming the labor legislation, how many of these interventions can be included there. And employment policy is another important dimension, and I think Sri Lanka does not have an employment policy, but it had an employment policy, but way back in 2023, which is outdated. So there is a need for employment policy also to promote the participation and to address all these gaps, including gender pay gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving this perspective and also from other countries and the region. When we speak of women's labor force participation, all of us acknowledge that we can't have this conversation if we don't involve private sector. And I would like to apply with my next question to Tanuja. And what was the drive for Mass Holdings to start working on inclusion and promotion of women and the subsequent steps that have been undertaken? If we could start from there. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. And thank you very much, Professor Delaney, for that incredible amount of work. For MS Holdings, we're apparel sector. So it's almost a given, I would think, that we need to focus on that workforce. We are privileged in the sense that we're one of those sectors that you see a lot of women coming in, thousands. And for us, while we are able to provide that employment opportunity, it also means, I think, in this conversation, that piece about enabling. So everything that was spoken of by many of you before, safety. So whether it is how you're coming to the workplace, so transport, that's one of the first things that we provided, because we knew, because all of this is connected to whether you can be a sustainable business as well. You need women to be able to come to work in a safe, secure way. So providing transport was one of the things we did. And the work we do right now through what we call the Women Go Beyond program, it completes 22 years. It started really by understanding some of the gaps very much at the grassroots, and then looking at how do we benchmark, how do we look at all of these things that are coming out through the reports and the data. So safety also means making sure the workplace has a robust system to deal with harassment, bullying, discrimination, all of those things. So my work looks at the gender equity piece, but also code of conduct, which is labor and having enough avenues to raise an issue, having a robust system to address those grievances, from your traditional methods like the suggestion boxes, HR, to having different people like code officers, to having a hotline, an online platform, and many other avenues, and also ways of addressing those issues. As was mentioned, we've ratified the C190 this year, but for many companies, not just MAS, for us, we're a massive workforce. We're 90,000 people globally. But whatever the size of the organization, in different ways, like I said, we might have a hotline and an online platform and many other things, but to have some format where you have an independent party who is looking into complaints, violations, and grievances, it doesn't have to be the gamut of things. But also then for us, the Women Go Beyond program looks at not only making sure the workplace is safe, but also then what happens in the community? How do you deal with gender-based violence? How do you make sure your workforce also understands what the law is, what your recourse is, where you can go? We also look at health, specifically menstrual to menopause. Again, for us, it is a very clear business case. It is a very clear responsibility. I know that it's not the same across industries because labor force is very different. But what we have seen is looking at everything from nutrition to health to prenatal care to pregnancy and then postnatal challenges that are faced by women. It means that you have the talent, you have that engagement and productivity as well. When we talk about the labor force and for us as an industry where we have women coming in, another big question for us is how do you make sure they come in and then also have room to progress? So moving them through the ranks into leadership is another big focus area for us. And for that, from day one, there is skill development, there is leadership that is built into your job role. So you come in as a machine operator and then you have the opportunity to become team leader, group leader, and then how do you move through? So that requires technical training, but also leadership development, other skills. So many things that were mentioned in Professor Delaney's report in terms of whether it's English language training, digital literacy. Those are things we take on through the programs that we do because that means women are able to then not only come in and take the first job, but then also move through. Another thing we do is look at women entrepreneurs. So we do skill development, which is not related to your job role, meaning you can learn to get your driver's license or you can learn baking or tailoring or some other craft because we have shift-based work and women can then, and we do see many women who start their own business while they work in the factory. So we have seen over the years, over about 30 years now, that the population that we have is empowered. They're smart, they're willing to take on opportunity. If you just have an opening, they will take that on. And they are able to have those conversations at home about what they need, about the support they need. So employers taking on some of that work means that you have a workforce that is more empowered, more interested, more engaged, more innovative. It's not easy though. I mean, all of this work we've been doing over, I would say 30 years and 20 years in a formal program means there are challenges, there are gaps. We move forward and then we move back sometimes. But we do see increase in sectors. For example, for us, the difficulty is getting women into operational roles, management, in ops roles, manufacturing roles, women in industrial engineering. So we've done work focusing on women in engineering, for example, women in operations, looking at what their gaps and challenges are, what do we need to do. So while we have policies, frameworks in place, it also means we have to do a lot of work with our managers, with line leaders, with supervisors. Something that was mentioned was also dealing with unconscious biases, training people actively to check and address those. Men and women both. So that's very quickly some of the work that we've taken on. But we do see that for us, there is a business benefit in the sense that there is also a sense of for retention. It's very, very helpful. People feel like they're getting something beyond what they're paid also, where you feel like you want to participate. There's also a connectivity in terms of your customer, your consumer. We work in the global markets. But also different companies, I think, can take on that work at different levels in different ways based on your capacity. So to your question of why did MAS get in, I think it's a very clear thing for us. But in terms of having a formal program with a multitude of levers that we have to pull on, from health to safety, addressing violence, addressing leadership, entrepreneurship, all of that, it is very much, and also very importantly, the care responsibility. So we do provide childcare support in the form of allowances, sometimes in the form of having our own creches. But again, so that is, and then even flexible work, paternity leave. A lot of that tends to be seen as beyond what is required sometimes. And then that also becomes a negotiation. How competitive are you now? Because not everyone is providing it. So there's constantly a tussle between why we want to do this. It makes complete sense. But if it is not the norm and if policy doesn't come in to support it, it also becomes a question of, oh, why should you be doing it versus someone else? I'll stop there and maybe add later.
Thank you very much. I think one important point was for me that gender equality is not a social issue only, and that it has its own business and economic case. Why should we be looking at it? And speaking of private sector, I'm sure there's a lot of policies and systems that need to be in place to make these changes happen. So Upulka, based on John Keel's holdings, if you could share about some of your initiatives in that regard, coming from human resource HR perspective.
Thank you to the ADB for inviting John Keels to be part of this very important conversation. And thank you, Professor Dilani Gunawardena, for that excellent presentation. And like I told you, I found myself nodding along because that thinking is so resonant with everything that we've been doing as well. And some of your prescriptions, for example, I found myself nodding along because we already practice some of that. So in terms of what John Keels does, let me first put a little context in terms of what our operation is like for anyone who's not very familiar. We are the largest listed conglomerate on the Colombo Stock Exchange, 18,000 plus colleagues. So not as large as MAS in that sense, but we are more diverse. So our challenges are more diverse. We operate in 7 sectors, 70 plus companies. So our sectors range from leisure, property, consumer foods, transportation, IT, financial services. So we are very widespread in that sense, and our challenges are therefore widespread. But one thing we've taken as a uniform commitment across the group is, I think the business case really drove it, because we need access to better talent. As the group grows, as our businesses grow, we do need more and more talent. And that talent, there is no sort of gender restriction on where that talent might be unlocked from. So we have set ourselves a target of becoming 40 by 30, which is 40% female by 2030. Today, we stand at 36%, having made good progress over the years. And we are ahead of the Sri Lanka's FLFP of 32%, which is in a way gratifying, but also concerning. So the result of that, to answer the question, that the initiatives that brought us there have been manifold, so many different types of initiatives addressing different aspects. One thing I think we've got right is the infrastructure that drives it, because diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-harassment, all of this is work. And unless you have someone who owns that work in an organization, it becomes relegated to the province of people who are passionate about it. And it becomes like, care work within the organization, in a sense, unpaid work. So we have certain roles, for example, like mine, who has oversight of diversity, equity, and inclusivity. We have a group of who are called DEI champions, who champion different pillar verticals. We have picked certain priority areas, gender being one of them. And we also have people called sector champions. And these people are all at a certain level of seniority, people who sit on the general management committees of those sectors and therefore are able to influence decisions. And they then work with junior teams to kind of bring all of this to life and to land it in the way that it makes sense for the sector. Because whilst we have taken a 40 by 30 goal, that doesn't mean that every sector has to hit 40. Some sectors will hit more. For example, in our IT sector, we have a BPO company, which is about 60% female. We have our flexible work in place. We have our remote work in place where the role permits it. So some of these sectors are able to really benefit from those policies and really ramp up their female recruitment. Whereas some other sectors like leisure traditionally, transportation, etc., have struggled because by virtue of the work that is there and the social norms around it, just like apparel some time ago had these taboos around or misconceptions about apparel not being the right kind of workplace for a woman. Leisure had similar kind of taboos around it, which our employees have done a lot to counter. So these are some of the things. And then I can quickly touch on some of the other things that we've done. I think Professor touched on unconscious bias training, anti-harassment training. These are things that we do. For example, our anti-harassment training is a mandatory module that everyone who joins the organization has to go through. And so that really does move the needle. And one thing we find is when we talk more about these topics, the caseload rises and then it levels off, because sometimes what people bring to the fore are things they have experienced years ago. And now when we talk about it, it gives them permission to come out and kind of raise those complaints and have them addressed. So unconscious, the training that I've mentioned, one thing that John Kears is known for is our parental leave policy of 100 equal days, both for men and women. So to the point that was made earlier, yes, we bear the full cost of that, whether it be OT for someone else who's taking on that workload, whether it be hiring a temporary worker to fill the gap, we take on those costs. But the thinking behind it is, if it's only maternity leave, then those biases are reinforced. Organizations, even the most well-meaning organizations, will think twice about hiring a woman if the operational demand is high. So that is one thing we've done. So we have employer-supported childcare, sanitary napkins. Our female employees get a quota of sanitary napkins. We work on menstrual care. We do women-centric training. So I'm just throwing a bunch of things here because there's a lot that goes on. But the thinking behind all of that stems from, we need talent. Where can we find it? We need women in the workforce. So let's create a workplace that permits them to come in and kind of be productive and contribute.
Thank you very much for sharing such great practices. So we are really limited in time. So we have one round of questions, but I really want to give 2-3 minutes each. And I will start with Anup. So it's like elephant in a room that social norms, I think, is cutting across some of the factors that are shaping female labor force participation. And we need more allies, men, communities in that. And thanks for being with us on the panel, the only man. But if you could share what we need to do to break this and address this challenge a bit, get more allies in our.
And thank you. And I will be very brief. In the context of Sri Lanka, the study shows that women are largely out of the labor force because of the burden or unequal distribution of the unpaid care work, which is around 59% of women response that they are outside the labor force just because of the care work. And again, the social norm time and again reinforce the role women plays in the care work. In the context of ILO, as all of you know, promotes a collective response to address these challenges, and the fundamental framework is the ILO 5R framework, which emphasizes on recognizing the care work, reduce the intensity of the care work, redistribute the care work between men and women and other actors, and also to reward the care work, those who are in the paid care work. You will find that that is also not or are poorly paid, and also to give representation to the care work and care recipients in the policy making. So that is the framework that ILO, through the discussion with employers, workers, and government have adopted. And then there is another approach that ILO promotes is about care diamond, which talks about distribution of the care work among the household, government, employers, and communities. And this calls for investment in child care, investment in elderly care, and investment in family-friendly workplace policies, investment in social protection, and initiative to encourage men also to take up the care responsibilities. And in the context of Sri Lanka in particular, there are studies which ILO has done, which says that if you are investing in care infrastructure, it has the potential to generate around 800 to 876,000 jobs, and these jobs would be primarily in the formal sector, and these jobs would be primarily taken up by the women. So that is the potential of investment in care infrastructure and in collective response. And every penny that or every dollar you are investing in a comprehensive care package has a potential to contribute 8% to Sri Lanka's GDP. So that is the study. And in Sri Lanka, the political and there is great buy-in at the highest level in the government on promoting care services and care investment. Recently, ILO also did the South for Care event, in which Honorable Prime Minister highlighted the importance of the investing in the care through, if you can see at the LinkedIn post, she highlighted very eloquently. And many of you in the hall also must be knowing that government is very soon is going to or the cabinet is going to adopt the National Action Plan on Social Care as a part of the overall social protection strategy. There is a pillar on social care, and there is a across the government drafting of this national social care policy with the leadership of Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Women, and Ministry of Rural Development. And that provides the framework for bringing all the stakeholders to promote the action plan on social care. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we know how social norms are related to all the care work expectations that women do. Professor Rahman, my question is, we know it's a very complex issue that we have been discussing today, but if you had to think of 3 actions, maybe in the short term, just very briefly, what would they be that needs to be addressed as a priority to a little bit enhance female labor force participation in Sri Lanka?
Thank you, Keta. Just to clarify, I'm not a professor. I'm not competing with you, Delaney. Just a doctor, one of the more useless kinds. But talking about doctors, and I would say a key thing is health. And we are talking about institutions and so on. We are not going to be able to afford that for a long time. And also, it's all very well transforming care workers into, unpaid care workers into paid care workers. I mean, the burden of care is going to be so high that who is going to be able to afford this? So I think we have to focus on prevention. And there, I think we have not done a lot what we should have. For example, there is this issue of increasing obesity among women and the impact on arthritis, which of course creates mobility issues. They can't go to work, they can't do as much, and then they also have to be looked after. Now, talking about that particular service of the midwife, Delaney, that can easily be transformed into something which monitors women's weight, gives them dietary advice, that kind of thing. But now I mentioned this to a doctor I know, and she said that actually they are part of the problem. Yes, because apparently they tell women who are pregnant, oh, now you have to eat for 2 people. So first child, 10 kilos on. Second child, another 10. Menopause, another 10, and then you're 30 kilos overweight. So I think this is one policy which I think, one program even, which we can tweak, retrain the existing cadres, deploy them without the, without the kind of costs which would normally prevail. The other issue, I think, is, we are talking about violence in the home, domestic violence. That's what the husband usually does. Then there's violence, harassment in the workplace, which is usually what the manager, the boss does. But we are forgetting there is a general criminality in society which has not been addressed, and which is having a direct impact on economic growth and on whether women can work. Now, I know of a young person who has some land in Valley Gama. I suggested she starts a B&B in her property there. She said, my goodness, no, I will have to pay kappa. So there are protection, extortion records. And you mentioned about going to the police. Police are also part of the problem. There's that saying in Sinhala, "Batak niyarat goyam kaina, kaata kiyamuda me amaru," which, let me translate. Even if the hedge and the fence eat the paddy, who are we to go for protection of the paddy? So I think now criminality again can be addressed without budgetary outlay. Right? It just means breaking these networks, the influence, the corruption, everybody in everybody's pockets, because that is what is perpetuating this system. So if you are talking about political incentive, right, government's will, that is where the will has to be exercised. If you rupture that particularly putrefying boil, a lot of these problems will sort themselves out. They will give opportunities for women to start their own business, because Heels and Mars, how many can they employ? Right? 120,000 they account for together. But how many women are out there? How many small businesses are out there? Most people who are employed in micro, small, and medium industries, not in industries in sectors like these companies belong. And they can do all they do because they can invest in it. They have the ballast. The ordinary, Batkade person is struggling to pay the electricity bill because the pricing mechanism is way off. Basically, the Batkade person is subsidizing your hotel. Isn't that true? When it comes to electricity, because you get subsidized, special, whatever. But the Batkade person has to pay the tariff. So there are these huge structural inequalities and systems of extortion. I'm not saying by you, by the police, the various nodes in this network. So if that can be addressed, we can move forward a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for emphasizing the structural barriers, but very context specific also. All right. So my next question is that we had a lot of the policies in place, but how we make them responsive to the emerging challenges. And then the implementation is another, I think, aspect. So, but very briefly, and then we have time for questions.
Yes, we have enough laws, but when it comes to implementation, it's far behind what is expected. All problem behind that is the attitude problem and the cultural problems. The maternity, under the maternity benefits ordinance, it says mother should be given 2 hours of feeding intervals until the child is 1 year old. But, and if there is a crutch in the workplace itself, that 1 hour's period could be cut down to half an hour. But there are employers who misuse this. That is an attitude problem. So we have to change the mindset and how the citizens are looking at a thing like that. It's a sensitive thing. They should know, they should be made aware that if the child is made in a healthier way, the workforce will be more healthier in the future. That attitude change and the cultural change. That's let me take another example. The paternal leave provision is there in the public sector law, establishment code. With that, father gets 3 days of leave for a childbirth. But the thing is that we have come across incidents that the father gets that paternal leave and goes on trips. That is not the expected thing by the law, the international recommendation or the health experts' point of view, with the cultural changes when the culture is the family is going to a nuclear family, that respect should be there with the responsibility is also there with the husband, but that is not taught from the culture and with the education. So the education reform also should address these things, and the education should look at soft skills and respecting others, respecting the laws. The holistic changes are necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'll move to private sector now. And I think what you have shared is still an exception and not a norm across private sector companies. So what is it that we need to do to incentivize more private sector companies? Perhaps this would be my one question to. I do think if you're looking at a viable model, it should probably be more collaboration. So you have more public-private partnership where, yes, we do have laws, but I think legislation and policy does come into play in the sense that whether it is more equal parental leave, labor laws that also support flexibility, part-time work, because right now it doesn't. So those of us who do have policies have to really jump through hoops to make it work. Also, if you take, for example, something like childcare, monitoring, registration, things like that, which also can give private sector some comfort if they are reimbursing or giving an allowance or even collaborating with external creches, etc. Some kind of collaboration where there's some regulation, monitoring, so there is some confidence in the kind of childcare that is provided or the safety of the place. So for me, I think more collaboration, more public-private partnership, where all sectors understand that this is not a nice to have. Because right now we're trying to fix and solve for something that should have been baked in to the way we work, to the way we do business, to the way we operate. It just wasn't. And that is a system that we've grown up in, the patriarchal system that we've lived in. But now we're trying to address something that is pretty much broken. So that is not an easy task, because it is easy to see that, oh, things work. Why do we have to bring these new things in? Why do we have to, do and invest and kind of add more cost? And I understand businesses thinking like that, except that I think we need to all sit back and look at what Upulka said. You need labor, you need talent. So it needs to be a partnership and everyone coming together to say, we need this for the economy. So how do we work together where the state sector brings in that support of policy, law, monitoring, which I think is probably more doable than the funding, if you think about it in the short term. And then private sector also coming in to say, how do we step in and collaborate better?
Could I please ask you to repeat the question?
how we can encourage private sector to make their in terms of women's employment and attainment and promotion.
Okay. So I think in terms of encouraging the private sector, I think Tanuja captured a lot of what I was also thinking about. I think sometimes the problem is also not really only on the demand side. Now, there are a lot of employers who look for female talent, but sometimes it's difficult to get them into the workplace because of certain other structural barriers. For example, if safe transportation is not available to bring these people to work. Now, companies like MAS will invest in bringing these shift workers to work. Now, in our diverse operations, we don't have the ability to do that, provide transportation for every single female worker who comes in. So we do have sometimes employees who come in broken in the morning because they've encountered harassment, or their families then put pressure on them saying, this job is not worth the struggle of getting yourself to work. So fixing transportation, I think, is something that will help on the supply side of things. The other is, I think, a lot was said about cultural norms, narratives around who is the breadwinner in work at home, right? In terms of who is the care provider. So I think shifting those narratives, I can just share one example from John Keel's. We have something called the advertising code, where when we put out advertisements, we try not to perpetuate these harmful myths of, in our consumer food sector, not having a Keel sausage being fried by a woman in the kitchen while the man is watching TV. So we try to influence that conversation, but I think it's a collective responsibility, media, social media, state, in kind of managing that perception so that more women feel empowered to come into the workplace and feel as free as men would in owning that space. So I think another thing would probably be, again, along the care responsibility piece. I think we alluded to it earlier. Organizations now, our 100-day parental leave policy, we bear the full cost of that. So some sort of subsidy support, because we truly feel that having paternity leave is something, one, it has lots of benefits. One is recognizing the role of the man in a child's upbringing, supporting a woman when they have to finish their parental leave. For example, our paternity leave can be taken over the first 200 days of a child's life. So, for example, let's say there's a state sector mom who has to go back after the 84 days, then the John Keel's father can step in to cover the rest of the child care support that is required. And I think a lot of these other things that were said about elder care, care for the disabled, which hold women back from coming into the workplace, will help well-intentioned employers bring more women in and support them within the boundaries of our workplaces. Well-intentioned large employers do a lot, but I think those can be amplified, and particularly for the MSME sector, which employs 50%, 60% of our workforce. So like Professor Ramani very rightly said, Dr. Ramani very rightly said, not all employers are able to extend the kind of support we do, but even those of us who extend that support can certainly benefit from a more enabling infrastructure widely.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think creating enabling system, I think that's very, all of us has a role in it, I believe. Let's move to, I think we have time for 2 questions. So just I will read out. Maybe the first one is related to, despite all these laws and policies that are in place, are there any plans to expand the scope to capture the needs of women engaged in the informal sector? Would you like to take this question?
Yes, we have given thought of that. The informal sector, in the sense, we have a lot of manpower employees in the cleaning and domesticates. They are working as manpower workers. So we have given thought to regulate them under labor laws. We are trying to get them to register under the Department of Labor, and that could be amalgamated with the tax system and the EPF everything. That's how we are going to, we have thought of regulating them.
And I think entrepreneurship is very much also not formal sector. So, and ADB has been supporting also a lot of regulatory reforms as well as women's access to finance. So that's, I think, another stream that can be further improved and explored. There is another question. So I would frame it that way, that in the age of digitization, technology development, when industries evolve and the new jobs are created, how can we ensure that women are ready for jobs of future? I would say it that way. What is it that we need to do? Please. Thoughts?
Yes, that's what I told earlier as well. The education should align with the market demand. For example, I did agricultural economics. Now I have ended up at Department of Labor. So we have to think of what is needed, the employment, the workforce needed for the country, and align the education system tally with the requirement. And when it comes to the younger people who drop out from O-level education, we have to create more opportunities for technology and the VTA education. Most of the people do not know about these laws. They think that the most of the private sector people think that no person under the age of 18 should be employed. The people, the persons between 16 years and 18 years could be employed unless it is not an hazardous employment. So that opportunity is not taken by the employers. So a lot of awareness is needed, and also should align the requirement with the need. The education should align with the need of the workplace.
Thank you. Yes, please. Then maybe private sector.
I may have hogged this mic for a bit, so why don't you go, and then I can be shut up later. Are you sure? Okay. The issue of education, and in fact this links with something you said, Delaney, and that is to make education compulsory until 18. Now there's education and education, and given the current culture and content of education, I think that's a bad idea, because you keep young people back in school when they can be far more productive outside, because the education they are currently getting, particularly up to the O-levels, is really bad. So until the education reforms, until there are good reforms, and they are keeping them for 2 more years in school is going to, reduce labor supply without any appreciable return in terms of productivity increases. That is one issue I would like to highlight in terms of education. The other thing is, we need to be realistic about what kind of economic sectors we have a comparative advantage in. Now, when it comes to technology and all, I mean, look at those robots walking out of China. Are we going to be able to do that kind of thing? Do we have the capital? Do we have the economies of scale? I think we have to be very careful about what we go to invest in terms of education. There is so much that needs to be done at general education level. Let me tell you, I mean, I do some teaching of O-level children. If you look at the textbooks, you wonder who on earth wrote them. There is no structure, it is dense, there's no point, there's no conceptual framework. Children are just trained to to read and then vomit it out. They can't think. So what are we going to do with workers like this in the age of AI? AI remembers everything. Now AI can analyze and think also. So what can our children do going through this system? So I think we have to think very carefully about the kind of transferable skills we need to give children, where they can apply their knowledge, apply their thinking skills, their innovative skills, and adapt to any situation. So education reforms, I think, are fundamental, but I don't know how they are doing it. I know that textbooks are written by administrative people in zonal offices of unheard places. So this is the current system. And why is that? Because of patronage systems within those ministries. Otherwise, how are they able to design textbook and decide what people are going to study? So there are huge problems which have to be fixed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a problem across that, how even if we look at from gender perspective of the curriculum, etc., that it lacks very much gender sensitivity, right? If we could hear from either of you.
Okay, so I think the question was, how do we enable women to kind of be more employable? I think Professor's study gave us two directions, digital literacy and English. Absolutely, because I think now we spoke about challenges of transportation, etc., right? Where flexible work exists or remote work exists, a woman then can circumvent a lot of these problems if they are digitally literate and they have good language skills and they have a connection, an internet connection and devices. So these can really unlock a lot of economic potential for women. So those two, absolutely. And to the point that Dr. Ramani made, I think we have to look at, whether it be men or women, we have to look at what are the AI resilient jobs that will be there in the future, and equip our curricula, for example, really have to be tailored to give our young children and our young people skills that are resilient. The more human skills, I think, are the ones that will withstand AI and become even more valuable as time goes on. The skill of learning, for example, I really reiterate this everywhere I get an opportunity, because the skill of learning, like people say, change is the only constant. The skill and ability to learn is what will keep people employable, whether they be men or women. So I don't know, I'm not an educator, I don't know how to do that, but I think from a private sector employer lens, people who can learn and are agile are really the kind of people that we need, and therefore the kind of skills that let people do that are the future skills.
If I might just add one thing there, because we're looking at women and being equipped with these tools, a challenge that we see constantly, even in training, whether it is English language, digital skills, etc., is women are the ones who also struggle to come for the training, to give that time. So where we have opportunity also, where you might have 100 women and 20 men in that location, the women are the ones who really struggle to continue, again, that vicious cycle of care and no support at home, etc. So I think all of these need to be connected as we look at new skills for women. How do we make sure they have the time and practically actually step into these places and get that education and use the opportunities?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the great insights. And please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And I'm sure there's a lot of learning for all of us, whether we come from government, research organization, or as individuals being part of this society. Thank you very much.
And to our facilitator, our moderator this morning, Ketavan Sheze, thank you very much. Our panel, Mr. Anup Satpathy, Dr. Ramani Gunatilaka, Ms. Rupika Ranavaka, Thanuja Jayavardhana, and Upulka Samarakon. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the closing remarks. And on behalf of the ADB, I'd like to invite the Director of Gender Equality Division of the ADB, Keiko Novachka, who will join us online. Please don't go away after that. We've got something for you.
Good afternoon from Manila. My name is Keiko Nowacka. I'm the Gender Equality Director. And it's very hard to kind of come after such a rich panel discussion and the earlier kind of discussions that have been had this afternoon. And thank you so much for taking part in this really important serendipity discussion today. My team have prepared some remarks for me, but actually I really wanted to kind of reflect a little bit on what I heard very briefly. And first of all, I'm so happy to see how women's economic empowerment has been addressed in a very comprehensive and holistic way. I think today we've heard a lot about the different entry points for gender equality, and supporting women's economic empowerment. How do we really address the different challenges that we see in terms of the different entry points for change? Also recognizing how social norms play a key role. And I also heard about the role of the private sector, as well as kind of the skills to work transition. We had the good fortune of hosting your Prime Minister for our International Women's Day event here in Manila a few months ago on the 8th of March. And these were some points that she had also remarked. Sri Lanka boasts a very well-educated population, but we are not kind of capitalizing on that potential. So I wanted to leave you with some questions kind of for the future, because these discussions are really important. And I really admire all the different data, inputs, and insights that I heard today. But it's really kind of what's the call to action, what's the next steps, and of course, as ADB, we're really here to accompany you on those next steps. So it's thinking about what are the costs of not investing in gender equality and women's empowerment. At the moment, we are hearing, of course, from different governments, not just in Sri Lanka, about the different fiscal kind of the tight fiscal space, and perhaps that we can't have so much investment space for gender equality. This is not new. For those of us who have been working in this space for decades, there's always an excuse not to invest in gender equality. But thinking about the flip side is also key. So for this reason, ADB is developing a new policy on gender equality and women's empowerment, where we would like to kind of position gender equality and women's empowerment more centrally in national development discussions and investments. So really trying to respond to what the development contexts require, and really building up country diagnostics and country awareness and capacity to deliver on gender equality commitments. We've heard that Sri Lanka has many different, a very robust legal framework. I understand that there's a new Women's Economic Empowerment Action Plan, and ADB's been really proud to be able to partner and learn from Sri Lanka across that journey, whether that's women's entrepreneurship, women in agriculture. There's so many different areas, many more areas. Of course, the glass is always half full. So I guess it's thinking, like, I leave the question back to the audience for you to consider as you go back to your day-to-day jobs. What is the cost of not investing in gender equality and really working on that flip side? What are we losing by not having more women in the labor market? And it is disruptive to think about care and how care and social norms can be addressed in an economic sense. But it's disruptive the benefits are great and would have a multiplier effect. So Keta reminded us of jobs for the future. Well, a lot of those jobs that currently happen in the present are going to be in the past soon, with AI and other digital kind of transformations of our economies. So we need to be moving faster and quicker as a group. And ADB sees itself as part of an ecosystem with government and the private sector, research institutes, and other development organizations. And so we really kind of look forward to thinking more about what are the next steps, what should be our call for action, and where do we want to see the state of gender equality and women's empowerment, especially women's economic empowerment, in the next 4 or 5 years, and really think, like, hone in on that question, what are the costs of not investing in women's economic empowerment? So thank you so much for inviting me to give closing remarks today, and for a very rich discussion throughout my afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Ms. Nowacka. That question is what we are going to leave you with. But however, please look at the screen. There will be a QR code that comes up. We would like you to please fill the feedback form, the survey, because this is very important for for us to move forward in this knowledge series. So please do scan the QR code, fill in the feedback form as soon as you can. So there's been much discussion today on women, their participation in the labor force, what needs to be done, what policy reforms need to be taken in. Lots of discussion, cultural change, cultural mindsets. However, it shouldn't just remain in this room. You need to take it out there. Just remember that question. What are the costs to each of us, to each of our organizations, and to the country of non-investing in gender equality? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being a part of this discussion, an important one at that. I'm sure you would like some refreshments. There's lunch served in the foyer. Please do enjoy and continue this discussion beyond. Thank you.